Hey everybody, it's my birthday, and to mark the occasion, here's my review of Call of Duty World War II for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4, and what you're seeing here is of course the PC version. This review is coming to you courtesy of 17Kyle1. He sent me a copy of this to take a look at, so thank you for that, it is greatly appreciated. This is a first-person shooter developed by Sledgehammer Games and published by Activision on November 3rd of this year, and it is the 14th main game in the Call of Duty series. And they're back to World War II again. Because apparently, supposedly everyone was sick of futuristic Call of Duty, which I can understand some fatigue there, and they couldn't go back to modern warfare because I don't know. And of course, if they went with World War I, which would be very appropriate given that it's the 100-year anniversary of that particular war, and almost everyone seems to forget that it was even a thing, well, they would just be accused of copying Battlefield. So instead of going with any number of other historical conflicts, like say the Korean War, which to date I don't think has ever had a first-person shooter, or the Vietnam War, which to date has only had one decent first-person shooter, and that was Rising Storm 2, which was multiplayer only, they thought it would just be a good idea to supposedly bring the series back to its roots, with the one war that has been done to death so much that there's only one thing they could have done that has not been done before. And you know damn well they are never going to do that. And what is that? Well, that would be playing as the Wehrmacht. But of course, that would be controversial, and we can't have that anymore. But of course, I wouldn't trust any of the developers under Activision's wing with a Wehrmacht campaign to begin with. They would not be able to handle it with any degree of respect. So of course that begs the question of what I would consider them capable of handling, and given that Sledgehammer Games made Advanced Warfare, and Advanced Warfare was actually surprisingly decent as far as its campaign went, well, you'd think they would at least be able to handle what they've decided to handle with this particular game, which is only playing as Americans on the Western Front. You know, basically the most generic setting you could possibly have for a World War II shooter. Now, if you're wondering why I already sound negative, it's because I have a memory longer than that of a goldfish. I remember that for a very long period of time, we had tons and tons of World War II games. And not only do I remember that there were 6 games in the Call of Duty series prior to this that were set in World War II, 7 if you count the United Offensive expansion for the first game, well, I also remember that there were 14 games in the Medal of Honor series that were set in World War II, for which the whole lot were released between the years of 1999 and 2008. And that's just those 2 series. There are dozens of World War II shooters out there. Hell, between going through the stuff that I remember off the top of my head, either because it's in my game collection or just because I remember seeing it, and just doing a very quick Google search, which took me absolutely no effort whatsoever, I was able to come up with a list of over 40 World War II shooters. Most of which were first-person shooters, some of which were third-person shooters, a few of which were even tactical shooters. And there were even a few mixed in there that were all about sniping and stealth. Which brings up another point. Don't even get me started about throwing in normal stealth games into the mix, or tactics games, or strategy games, because then you get absolutely ridiculous with the amount of World War II games out there. So to all of you out there who seem to think that there is somehow a shortage of World War II games, guess what? You are very poorly informed. Educate yourself. But DW, I hear you saying, we haven't had a mainstream AAA World War II game in a while. And that is supposed to matter to me how exactly? I repeat, I do not have the memory of a goldfish. I actually can remember all of the Medal of Honor games and all of the Call of Duty games prior to this one. I played them all. And most of them are still readily available or are very easy to find used copies of. There is absolutely nothing stopping you from playing one of these previous World War II games. The only reason I could see people clamoring for a World War II game is because those previous games just aren't as pretty as modern games. And if that's what's preventing you from going back and playing, for example, the original Call of Duty, the finest World War II shooter ever made, or its follow-up, Call of Duty 2, which was a very good game, then I've got news for you, and this is going to be one of those difficult truths that you're going to need to understand. Graphics don't mean shit. What ultimately matter for a video game are story and gameplay. And as for the implications this has on Call of Duty World War II, it's quite simple. It's at a natural disadvantage to begin with. Now, does that mean it's a bad game? Not necessarily. It just means that I'm frustrated as hell with it because I'm so sick of people acting like this is fresh and exciting when all it is a rehash of things that we've been seeing for the last 20 years. So the question ultimately becomes, how good is it at rehashing what's been done over the past 20 years? Does it learn from previous games' mistakes and improve upon things? Does it learn from the previous Call of Duty games and improve upon their mistakes? Well, let's go ahead and delve right into this thing and find out where it succeeds, where it fails, and where it falls somewhere in between. And we're going to start things off by taking a look at the presentation and going ahead and getting that out of the way. And that marks the return of something that I had hoped I wouldn't have to use anymore with new games, but unfortunately with this one it seems like I have to, which is braun und grau und realistisch. Referring, of course, to the general, very bland, very muted color scheme that consists mostly of browns and grays, although in this case they do have a fair bit of green in there, and during the Battle of the Bulge levels they have a lot of snow in there, so there's a lot of white as well. Now luckily it's not anywhere near as bad in that regard as games around the 2005 to 2008 era where everything just looked absolutely awful because of that color scheme. But it does make me concerned that that craze might come back, and if it does, then that means many years more of really bland colors and really bland art styles. Now, of course, in this particular case, it is appropriate given the setting, but it's still something to keep an eye out for. Now, of course, once you get past the color scheme, there is the matter of visual fidelity to deal with here, and generally speaking, they've done quite a good job of putting a lot of detail into the character modeling and animations as well as the environments. That said, it's not all there. Whenever there's an important cutscene going on, the lip sync is usually pretty spot on, but when you're in the middle of a battle, often it won't even have any lip sync at all, even though the characters are talking. It's a bit jarring the first time you actually notice that, which is actually pretty early in the game, and then the more you get into the game, the more you notice it, and it kind of takes you out of the experience a bit. Another time you'll notice animation problems are when you get into the weapon animations, many of which are just laughably awful. To give you prime examples, loading the scoped sniper rifles with stripper clips, which is physically impossible on the actual guns. The scope gets in the way of the actual stripper clip, which in turn means you have to load them one round at a time. In fact, you can see exactly where the developers noticed this was a problem because they actually put the clip in at an angle as opposed to how stripper clips are actually fed into a rifle's magazine, which is straight into it from the top. Here's a bit of firearms education for those of you who don't understand how they work. There is actually a cutout in the rifle's magazine that allows you to place the stripper clip. It's required to actually feed the rounds into the magazine. If you can't fit the clip into the feed lip, then you can't push the rounds from the clip into the magazine. It just doesn't work. Then, of course, there's reloading the M1897 trench gun, which is called the combat shotgun in this game, where you just keep sticking rounds into the tube and then you pump the shotgun after you're done. That's a good way to end up with one less shotgun shell than you actually intended to load. In fact, it's actually kind of baffling because they have the correct animation when you load incendiary shells, which is you eject the shells that you don't need, and then you pull the pump back, which opens the action, you stick a shell in the chamber, you close the action by pushing the pump forward, and then you just stick whatever extra shells you want to put into the gun into the magazine tube. Now don't get me wrong, I'm fully aware that this is a complete nitpick kind of thing, but it's still annoying when someone who understands how guns work watches animations where the guns are not being handled properly. It's kind of the equivalent of if someone throws a pitch at a baseball game and they obviously don't know what they're doing, it's just cringe-inducing half the time. Anyway, I digress. Most of the weapon animations are actually fine. It's just a few here and there that you just kind of go, oh, that does not look right at all. And all this put together means that, generally speaking, with a few exceptions here and there, the visuals are actually rather solid. Although, you do have to keep in mind there are a few glitches here and there are some performance problems, but I will mention the performance problems when I get to the gameplay section. But as for an example of the glitches, here's one that was pretty amusing. Yeah, I'm really not sure what happened there. But as for the rest of the presentation, you've got voice acting which is generally pretty good, although a few accents here and there are a bit over-exaggerated and silly. For example, some of the German characters speak English, and they do their best to put on their ultra-stereotypical Nazi accent. It reminds me a lot of the old serials, or if you're not familiar with those, then more recently something like Indiana Jones, where you have characters going, "Good evening, Fräulein." It's not quite to that level of silliness, but it is fairly close at times, and you just sit there going, oh geez, not again.
Perhaps we can converse in English. As you know, I'm sure practice makes perfect.
Now that said, the Germans do actually speak German, unless you're playing multiplayer, in which case they speak German accented English. Although a lot of it is actually fake German accented English, which makes things a bit more awkward. That's not to say that there aren't German actors in this thing, there certainly are. It's just that not all of the roles are played by German actors when it's appropriate, and thus you can really tell when someone is not a German actor playing a German character. Come on, Activision and Sledgehammer, warum ist es so schwer zu verstehen? Anyway, apart from the occasionally silly accents and the occasional issues with the German language sections, there's not really too many things wrong with the voice acting. They generally do a pretty good job with it, and they portray their roles well enough. It's just the script is kind of a problem, but I'll get to that more in a moment. Things do get a bit messier once you get to the sound effects and the music, though. The music is just an utterly forgettable, painfully generic World War II movie or game soundtrack. Let's put it this way, if you've watched a movie or TV show set in World War II during the past 20 years, or you've played a video game set in World War II for the past 20 years, you've basically heard the music in Call of Duty World War II. That doesn't necessarily mean the music is bad, it's certainly well-made music, it's just that it's completely forgettable. It doesn't stick with you like other soundtracks could. Say what you wish about how appropriate the soundtrack was for Call of Duty World at War, but at least it was memorable. Here, I just feel like I'm playing any other World War II game or watching a World War II TV show or movie. I guess that's appropriate, but it's just boring. But then, of course, there are the sound effects, which are really not all that great. This is par for the course with the Call of Duty series at this point. All of the guns sound somewhat underpowered. They don't really have enough bass kick to them. So instead of the weapon sounds being rather nice and punchy, or the explosions feeling like they rattle you around a bit, they're just dull thuds, or the gun sounds sound like they're pea shooters, and it ends up being very unsatisfying as a result. I've been saying it for years, and from what it seems like, I'm going to be saying it for years and years hence. The sound in the Call of Duty games needs improvement. It's certainly not the worst I've ever heard, but for a game with production values this high, it's actually kind of shocking that the sound is as weak as it is. Because when you bring everything together, it always seems like the sound effects are the odd man out. You've usually got pretty solid visuals, you've got rather solid soundtrack even if it is forgettable, and you've generally got rather good voice acting, but the sound effects are always weak. And Call of Duty World War II is no exception in that regard. Frankly, it's just a shame. But here's the thing, as up and down as the presentation can be, that's not really what matters here. What really matter are the story and the gameplay. And I'm going to warn you ahead of time that in order to adequately discuss why the story is a problem, I actually have to spoil the entire thing. And quite frankly, I don't care if that hurts your feelings if you didn't want spoilers, because there is nothing to spoil. If you've played a World War II game in the past 20 years, or you've seen a World War II movie or TV show in the past 20 years, then you've already experienced everything there is to experience in Call of Duty World War II. Because this is quite simply the most generic World War II first-person shooter that I have ever seen. There is basically not a single World War II cliché that is not on full display here, and it is not only derivative of World War II movies and TV shows, but it's even derivative of other Call of Duty games and Medal of Honor. Literally every single thing this game does has already been done, and done to death. So I'm just going to go ahead and jump right into the story here, and if you don't want spoilers, then you can either turn off the video or you can skip ahead. That's your prerogative. I'm not going to bother putting a time code in, because there's absolutely nothing to spoil here, considering every single thing in this game has been done dozens of times before. Now then, in Call of Duty World War II, you play as Red Daniels, a member of the 1st Infantry Division, also known as the Big Red One, and the game opens by introducing you to your squad. And the gang's all here, and probably the only reason you'll ever remember their names is because they are constantly constantly being shouted throughout the course of the game. What you are going to remember, however, are the roles they serve in the story, because that's all that really matters with these characters. Like I said, they're archetypes, they're stereotypical, they have almost no character to them at all. So you've got your leader, Lieutenant Turner, who is of course the caring lieutenant who wants to make sure that his men get through the war safely. Then you've got the hard-ass Sergeant Pearson, who is of course trying to make up for his failures at a previous battle, in this case Kasserine Pass. And of course he ends up taking that out on your squad. Oh, and later on you find out he's an alcoholic too, so that's bonus points there. Then you have the veteran member of the squad, whose name is Aiello, if I remember correctly, and he has only 2 appreciable traits throughout the entirety of the game. First, he has basically no personality at all, and second, he's an Italian-American Catholic. And pretty much the only reason you would know this is because they pretty much shove it in your face at the beginning of the game when he's carrying a pendant of, if I remember correctly, St. Michael. Of course, the pendant only comes up a couple of times, and the first is at the very beginning of the game, where he loses it in a bet to the player character's best friend Zussman, who has exactly one personality trait, and that's that he's a bit of a smartass sometimes. Beyond that, he has only one other character trait, and it's one that the game constantly shoves in your face in a kind of obnoxious manner, and that's that he's a Jewish German-American, who happens to speak really, really terrible German, I might add. And then there's one other member of the squad, a guy who I actually forgot the name of completely and had to specifically go looking up because he is so completely bland and uninteresting, and that is Styles, who has exactly one character trait, and that's that he's a nerd. And he's not even a funny kind of nerd or anything, he's just annoying. All he does throughout the course of the game is correct people when they say something that's slightly incorrect, or he complains about things. Oh, and by the way, he's a photographer. Did you know that? Because that only is going to come up basically twice in the entire game. It's introduced at the beginning of the game, and it's not brought up again until the very end when you go through the concentration camps, where Daniels basically goes, "Get your camera, the world needs to know." Now then, once you're introduced to your squad, the next thing you do is storm the beaches of Normandy. And it's pretty much shot for shot taken from Saving Private Ryan, complete with the slow-mo shell shock as you stare in horror at the landing boats getting shot to pieces and set on fire, and you get to see people stumbling around with missing limbs and such like that. Because, by the way, did we mention that we're a serious war game here, and we're really trying to depict that war is hell? Except when we don't, which I'll get to in a moment. But here's the thing, I don't want to go through just a recreation of what I saw already in Saving Private Ryan. If I wanted that, I would just watch Saving Private Ryan. It's a really good movie. It's worth watching. If you haven't seen it, I very highly recommend it. And if you watch that movie, you will notice very quickly that every single World War II game that features the Normandy landings basically copies it. And the sad thing about that is absolutely none of them do it anywhere near as well as that movie did. Call of Duty World War II is no exception in that regard, and the funny part about it is they even try as hard as they can to just straight up copy scenes from it. And unfortunately, that's a trend that the game just kind of wears on its sleeve. Rather than even making an attempt to seem original or do its own thing, Call of Duty World War II just takes things from other games and movies and TV shows without really too much thought. Now, I already mentioned that they straight up copy Saving Private Ryan throughout the course of the Omaha beach landing, but on top of that, they also copy it at numerous other points throughout the game, and it is painfully obvious when they're doing that. I mean, hell, one of the characters in the Battle of the Bulge explicitly just says a line from the movie. Put me within a mile of this. Derivative is one thing, but just straight up copying things from movies, TV shows, and other games is frankly very tacky. And the worst part is, it doesn't stop there. Like I said, they copy Saving Private Ryan an awful lot throughout the course of the game, but they also copy shows like Band of Brothers, they copy other games like Medal of Honor and Call of Duty, as well as even other World War II games. Hell, there's one moment in the game where a guy tries to kick down a door and then he gets mowed down by machine gun fire through that door, and it's just straight up copied from numerous previous Call of Duty games. And I'm not talking about, oh, well, it's just a kind of throwback thing. No, I mean they literally copied the animation across all of the games. It's things like that, where you notice something and you're like, I've seen this before, or this is exactly the same as a previous Call of Duty game, or this is exactly the same as a Medal of Honor game, or insert whatever similarity it is here, that you'll just sit there and be taken out of the experience because you've seen it before. And it only gets worse the further you get into the game. Anyway, let's go ahead and move on with the rest of the story. So after you finish the Omaha beach landings, you move on to taking the town of Marigny, which basically consists of a brief on-foot segment, followed by driving a jeep with kind of floaty controls, followed by an extended turret section where you're trying to rescue Allied soldiers. And this is the level where it pretty much just blatantly shoves in your face, by the way, Player 1, you're a war hero, didn't you know this? I guess never mind that the previous level ends by showing Red just staring at his bloodied hands in horror. You see, this game is almost a mockery of itself, because on the one hand, you go into a level and it will constantly be shoving the "hey guys, war is hell" message in your face, and then at the same time, you're doing completely over-the-top action movie shenanigans. You're surviving things that would not be humanly possible to survive. You are taking on hundreds upon hundreds of German soldiers by yourself. And if the turret section in the second level wasn't enough to prove that you're a damn war hero, then you move on to the next level where it turns out you are in fact Rambo, and you are in fact a special agent. Because immediately after Marigny, you are assigned to the SOE, the Special Operations Executive, the Special Forces, and you are tasked with tracking down and stopping a train full of V-2 rockets. And thus the game introduces you to its stealth system, which I will get to later on when I talk about the gameplay, but it also shows off that you are basically a one-man killing machine who is capable of just sneaking into an area, wiping out anything in your path, and then just moving on like nothing was happening. And the thing is, that level starts with a stealth section and ends with a ridiculously over-the-top action movie jeep chase where you're in a jeep and you're chasing down the train and you end up derailing it in a ridiculously over-the-top spectacular fashion. Which you somehow survive, by the way. It's there that you meet up with your French resistance contact, Rousseau, who turns out to be a woman. Because of course it's a woman. Because we got a copy Medal of Honor Underground now, too. Because guess what the next level is? You play as Rousseau, who is trying to infiltrate a Nazi stronghold. This brings up a few points. First off, it's basically copying Medal of Honor Underground, because you did that sort of thing when you were playing as the French Resistance member in that particular game, who is also a woman, by the way. And then, of course, there are the people who are horribly misguided and think that this is the first time you're playing a female character in the campaign of a Call of Duty title without it being just your choice at the beginning, like in Black Ops 3. No, this is not anywhere near the first time that they've actually had you play as a female character. The first time would be in Call of Duty Finest Hour, where you played as a female Russian sniper. But anyway, this ultimately leads to the liberation of Paris, where it cuts back to Red once you've completed your objectives in that Nazi stronghold, and when I say Nazi stronghold, I mean it. It's literally an SS stronghold. Then the perspective switches back over to Red, who is down there with a bunch of French resistance people and his squad, and you help them liberate Paris by mowing down dozens, if not hundreds, of German soldiers. Never mind, I guess, that the Americans basically didn't even show up until Paris was already liberated. Or the fact that resistance during the liberation of Paris was actually pretty minimal. But no, we've gotta work American troops in there so we can have a level where you're in the liberation of Paris. It is extremely contrived. But more importantly, it's emblematic of the pandering that they do in this game. Cue morons out there screaming about SJWs or whatever, but in this particular case, it's a problem not because it's a female character who is playable in the game. That is not what bothers me about it at all. It's that she's only used for one level, and she's a completely throwaway moment. After the liberation of Paris, she's never mentioned again. It's like she never existed. It's pretty painfully obvious that they put that moment in there as a throwaway moment to say, hey guys, look, we're progressive, we have a female playable character for one level. We're so inclusive. They also do that sort of thing later on when they introduce the character of Howard during the Battle of the Bulge. Now, I will readily admit that playing as a French Resistance member throughout the campaign, or playing as the French Resistance member and then her just tagging along throughout the infantry battles would just be kind of ridiculous. But they could still have moments where they just recall what happened in Paris. They could have moments where like, hey, we got some new intel from our French Resistance contacts or whatever. It'd be a bit tricky to work it in, but they could still do it. What they've done with Howard, on the other hand, completely flies in the face of the actual history behind the war. You see, up until, if I remember correctly, 1948, it was definitely post-World War II, military units were actually segregated in the US. In other words, white men and black men did not really serve together in World War II, unless you count the white officers that led the platoons of black soldiers. This is not to say that black men did not fight in World War II. They certainly did fight, and they often fought with distinction. And their heroism during World War II was actually a big contributing factor to the presidential order that ultimately removed segregation from the military. That said, when there's only one black guy in the entire units, you are no longer being historically accurate, you are no longer being true to the experience of World War II, you are quite simply creating what is generally known as the token black guy. In other words, they basically put this character into the game just to say they have a black character in the game. And the way they handle the racial aspect of it is actually incredibly awkward. It comes across as painfully forced, and it really does make it obvious that the whole thing is just artificial. Again, it's not the fact that there's a black soldier in the game, it's that there's only one of them in the whole game, and nobody seems to be bothered, except for basically two people, by the fact that there's only one black guy in the whole frickin' unit. When in reality, black soldiers served with other black soldiers in their own platoons. And honestly, I'm kind of surprised they didn't do the same thing with Howard that they did with Rousseau, because you don't play as Howard, you just accompany him. And after the Battle of the Bulge mission, he just becomes part of the squad like it's nothing. It just screams of artificiality. In fact, that sense of artificiality is something that plagues the entire game, but we'll get there in a moment. For now, we had to backtrack a bit because between the Battle of the Bulge and the liberation of Paris, you have a sequence where the squad takes control of a hotel in Aachen, and then you have the Battle of Hürtgen Forest after that. Taking control of the hotel is a fairly straightforward level, but before you actually can take control of the hotel, you have a fairly brief segment where you take control of Perez in his Sherman tank. And it is the absolute worst part of the entire game, but I will get to that more later on when I get to the gameplay section, because it's the gameplay of that segment that really just ruins it. But for now, we're still talking about story here. So after the tank segment, you go and you take the hotel, and of course, in the hotel's basement, you find, what else? Civilians! Thus, we have to have the whole segment where the sergeant and the lieutenant argue about their orders, and the lieutenant's all, damn the orders, we've got to get these civvies out of here. And of course, the Germans shoot up the truck, and you end up losing one of the civilians, and it's supposed to be all, ooh, isn't this so sad? Except that you've only known these characters for the span of maybe 2 minutes. Their only defining trait is that they're civilians who happen to speak German. So while the segment is trying to say that war is hell not just for soldiers but for civilians too, it ends up almost inadvertently being a, hey, the Germans are bad guys, didn't you know that? Because they shot up a civilian truck now, except it's not a civilian truck, it's a German military truck that the Allies have commandeered. They had no way of knowing if there were German civilians in there. But anyway, the manner in which they introduce these characters and try to establish something vaguely resembling a bond with them is that the one woman's sister goes missing and you have to go back into the hotel to find the sister. Honestly, it feels like another pathetic attempt at trying to ape Saving Private Ryan by the sequence in that movie where they had one of the American GIs trying to help civilians and he ends up getting shot for it. Except Daniels doesn't get shot for this, the civilians get shot instead. Anyway, after that rather ham-fisted moment, you go to the Battle of Hürtgen Forest, and you have to go and take Hill 493. It's a fairly straightforward level until you hit the very end, in which case they bring a Tiger II into the battle, and you have to take it out with thermite. It's a total plot contrivance that you just don't have any anti-tank weapons up there, and so you end up having to run up behind it while the friendlies are distracting it, and then just press the use key a couple of times. Now, I played this on veterans, so that was a lot easier said than done, because they also have a lot of infantry there that just mow you down like it's nothing. But anyway, we've reached a point where we're roughly halfway through the game, and at this point, it's about time for someone major to die off, so they kill off the lieutenant. And it's in a hilariously predictable way as well. After you take out the tank, you're laying there on the ground all shell-shocked from it, so he runs over to help you out. And then he gets wounded by one of the members of the tank crew, and then you grab the lieutenant's revolver and shoot that guy in a really pathetic excuse of a QuickTime event. After which, the lieutenant's like, no, you have to leave me, I'll hold them off, you get out of here. And he goes down and almost no time at all, not really having much of an effect at all. Then throughout the rest of the game, Pearson gets more and more unhinged, and you, of course, sit there and you're like, Turner wouldn't have wanted this, and he goes, Turner's dead! Obviously, I'm exaggerating the reactions a bit there, but that's basically how it goes anyway. Anyway, after that, they go into the Battle of the Bulge section, where Howard helps you out with stuff, and then you call in air support, and you switch over to the perspective of a P-47 Thunderbolt. And this is the second worst part of the game, by the way. Not because of the section itself just being thematically a problem, but because the controls are terrible. And after doing some dogfighting, you end up going back to the perspective of Daniels on the ground, and you finish up the Battle of the Bulge. And then you have a brief segment after that where you act on some new intelligence and you go to take out some German supplies. And during this, Zussman gets captured and taken to a POW camp. Remember how I said before that Zussman is a Jewish German-American? Well, guess why they put that in the game? That's right, you have to rescue him from a concentration camp at the end of the game. Zussman may occupy the role of the wisecracking best friend, but his real role in the story is so you can have a reason to show a concentration camp in a World War II first-person shooter. Because, like I said before, this is the most generic World War II game I've ever played. They have to show all the cliches, including the liberation of a concentration camp. Except in this particular case, they don't liberate the concentration camp. It's one of the ones where the Germans marched all of the prisoners out and then they just started systematically murdering them all. So of course you have to have the sequence where you track down Zussman and you save him at the very last second by shooting that one last Nazi bastard in the face. Oh, and it is actually a Nazi, too. It's an SS officer. But before you do all of that, you have to have the sequence where Daniels gets wounded in battle, and Daniels ends up laying around in the hospital for several weeks while he's recovering. Now keep in mind, he's recovering from an incredibly stupid stunt where, when they captured Zussman, he went and chased after them by stealing a Jeep and just trying to drive the truck down. It really did not work very well at all. And, of course, since he's laying in hospital, the general comes around to him and hands him his discharge papers, says he's a war hero and that he's going to be getting a medal. And then you go into a dream cutscene where he's thinking about what it would be like to come home to his wife and live out the rest of their days. Except he can't, because Zussman has been captured, and damn it, he just cares too much about Zussman to leave him behind. So he has to go and confront Pearson, tear up his discharge papers right in front of the guy, and be like, you're gonna let me back into the squad, man. It is absolutely facepalm inducing, and one of the most ridiculously corny scenes in the entire game. But for some baffling reason, Pearson lets you back into the squad, even though he basically hates your guts, and you're sitting there just ranting to him about Turner and how he is trying to make up for his failures at Kasserine Pass and everything like that. And then after that, you go to the Battle of Remagen, and you try to secure the last bridge over the Rhine. Once you finish that, then you move on to the concentration camp segment, and then you have the epilogue, where you do in fact return to Texas. And, of course, he's from Texas, right? And you find out that his brother, who he's been referencing throughout the entire game, actually died years ago due to wounds he sustained when they were out hunting and they ran into a wolf. Because you have to have one last bit of cliche in the story there, where the brother calls back to him and goes, "Take the shot, Red!" And he takes the shot and kills the Nazi. Daniels lays his bronze star on his brother's gravestone and says, "You're the one who deserved this because you taught me how to shoot." And that's how the game ends. It rolls the credits, and you feel like you've just wasted the past 5 to 7 hours of your life. If it actually did something unique and interesting with World War II, instead of being this pandering mess of just the most generic garbage you can possibly imagine for World War II, then things might be a bit different. But as it stands, this actually ends up being the worst World War II shooter campaign I've ever played, not because it's just generic, but because it's historically inaccurate as all hell, and it's just completely unapologetic in how blatantly gamey and artificial everything is. So many plot points are just made for pure convenience sake so they can have a sequence to show off their pretty graphics, or to show off some carnage, or to show off something that's supposed to be controversial or disturbing. But it's done in such a haphazardly slapped together way that it just ends up being insulting to the actual history of World War II. There was basically no attempt whatsoever to actually be historically accurate. I already mentioned the elements with the Americans liberating Paris, even though they didn't, and the moments like with Howard and the complete trivialization of black soldiers during World War II, but there's also decisions that are just frankly utterly baffling during the campaign. Like, why the hell does Daniels have a Lee Enfield rifle during the Battle of the Bulge? He's an American soldier. Why does he have a British rifle? More importantly, why does he have a scoped British rifle? There's really only two logical options that he would have for a scoped rifle of that time. He would either have a Kar 98 that he scavenged from an enemy, or he would have a Springfield with a scope on it. There is absolutely no reason he would have a Lee Enfield during that particular campaign because supplies were so limited that he wouldn't have any ammunition at all, let alone having ammunition to begin with because the British supply lines would be supplying the British and not the Americans. But then there's other things that are just utterly baffling, like the SVT-40 and PPSH apparently being standard issue for the Wehrmacht. Now, you could make an argument for the so-called Waffe-28, it's the MP-28 submachine gun. Those actually were made in Germany, but the standard issue submachine gun of the Wehrmacht was the MP-40, not the MP-28, and most certainly not the Russian PPSH. Which, to make matters worse, that is apparently standard issue of all of the troops on Omaha Beach. You know, the coast of France, where there is no possible way they would have had that many PPSHs and that much 7.62 Tokarev ammunition. You could maybe make an argument for the Eastern Front, but you're certainly not making an argument for the Western Front in that regard. It's absurd. And it's that kind of blinding historical accuracy, I put that in extreme air quotes by the way, that just makes this thing a total mockery of World War II. They're trying to treat this as an extremely serious World War II game, and yet they just don't even give a crap about any sort of historical accuracy whatsoever. It's like they didn't know whether they wanted to make a goofy, Inglourious Basterds style action movie game, or they wanted to make a serious war movie style game like Saving Private Ryan or Band of Brothers. So they said, screw it, we're just gonna make all of it all together, and it just ends up being a complete fucking disaster. But the worst part is, it's not just the writing that is absolutely plagued with problems. Because you go over into the gameplay, hoping that things will get at least better than the garbage that you're experiencing as far as the writing goes, and you find out very quickly, within the first few minutes of the game, that the gameplay is just as much of a problem as the writing is. Pop quiz. What happens when you remove regenerating health from a game that is built entirely around regenerating health? It's a trick question. The answer is this. You may be thinking, well, DW, obviously you need to get health packs. They're obviously just scattered around the level. No, they're not. In that particular instance, that's before you even get access to your first health pack, because the tutorial has not deemed it necessary to give you one yet. That's right, not only does the game open on Omaha Beach, an absolute meat grinder where anywhere you go you are going to get hit by incoming fire, but it decides that the first time it's going to give you a health pack is when it's way too late. Oh, and by the way, you're completely at the mercy of the checkpoint system, so if you've used up all of the health packs that you've managed to gather and you have no health packs left, and you're barely even alive at that point, well, guess what? You're gonna have a checkpoint where it goes back and you get instantly hit and die. I actually lost count of the number of times this happened to me throughout the course of the campaign. I may have even had a health pack that I could use to immediately top up my health, but the checkpoint had saved when I had almost no health at all. Oh, what's that? You don't believe me? Look at this shit. Oh, and if you think that's bad, I actually had way more instances of instant deaths. One hit from almost full health, and I just dropped instantly. Again, if you don't believe me, observe.
You hurt?
But by far, the most commonplace deaths were ones that I couldn't even react to. You may be going, "Get good, DW, you suck at the game." Well, I challenge you to get good when this is what happens most of the time.
Sergeant, come!
Down!
Get down now!
I'm sorry, but if that sort of bullshit instant death garbage looks fun to you, then you are a masochist. I played through the campaign on Veteran for two reasons. The first of which is I'm stubborn as hell and refuse to let the game beat me, and the second was I normally play through all of the Call of Duty games on Hardened and Veteran. And that includes the original Call of Duty, which also had health packs. The thing is, those health packs were placed in appropriate locations throughout the game. If you picked one up, it instantly healed you. You didn't have to go through an animation in order to heal yourself. Of course, it also helped that the enemies weren't complete bullet sponges in the original Call of Duty either. They sometimes take upwards of half a magazine of rifle ammo to bring down. I have seen enemies take numerous headshots before going down, and they weren't even wearing helmets. And even more fun, that was using sniper rifles. You know, if this were something like Wolfenstein, where the game is completely and utterly ridiculous, I could maybe understand that. But they are trying to treat this as an extremely, deadly serious war game. And yet they have enemies wandering around with MG42s that can take multiple rifle rounds to the face and be perfectly fine? Are you fucking joking here? I mean, I get that I played through on Veteran, it's supposed to be difficult, but this is ridiculous. And you know what the even funnier part about this is? I actually went back and started up a few levels on Recruit difficulty just to see if it's any different. There are even still bullet sponges on Recruit difficulty. And you even still have the random instant deaths on Recruit difficulty. It makes no sense. The only difference the game throws at you is that you almost never actually get hit. So as far as I can tell, all the Veteran difficulty does is two things. First, it makes the enemies pinpoint accurate from ridiculous distances from absolutely impossible angles, and second, it makes the enemy's damage output insane. That is an extremely cheap, lazy way of doing difficulty settings in a video game, and it goes a long way to shattering any sense of immersion you possibly could have had from this thing. None of this is helped by the fact that your friendly troops are dumber than a sack of hammers. They basically can't even hit the broadside of a barn, and that's assuming that the barn is quite literally 1 centimeter away from the muzzle of their gun. They are completely useless apart from a handful of your squad mates which have special abilities. Now these gradually recharge over time as you take out enemies, and eventually you'll be able to go over to one of your squad mates and press a button to call out for their special ability. The abilities are as follows. Turner gives you ammo, Pearson spots enemies, Aiello gives you mortar strikes, which are just smoke grenades that you throw at an enemy and then they get hit with a mortar strike. Zussman gives you health packs, and Styles gives you grenades. And depending on the situation, you may have access to all of these, or you may have access to none of them. It's just wildly dependent on whether or not the game decides, oh hey, you're going to be alone now. Needless to say, however, if you're playing on Veteran difficulty, then Zussman is going to become the most important member of your party, and you're going to need to be as close to him as possible, just so you can stay alive. I mean, sure, none of your squad mates are remotely useful in actually taking out enemies, but hey, at least you can get Zussman to throw you medkits so you can kind of stay alive while you do all the work for them. You see, this is something that has really proved problematic with the Call of Duty series for quite a long time now, and it goes back to what the series was actually founded on. You see, in the original Call of Duty, the idea was no one fights alone. Ever since about Modern Warfare 2, you could make the argument for Modern Warfare 1, but Modern Warfare 2 especially, the series has gone from that to you are the big damn hero, and the entire war effort revolves entirely around you. Now, the funny thing about Call of Duty World War II is that they kind of tried to do away with that, at least from a narrative standpoint, but as far as the gameplay is concerned, you're the only one who matters. Unless you're playing on Recruit difficulty, all the enemies target you. You are the one who has to take out all of the enemies, because your squad mates do nothing. Oh look, a bunch of enemy planes are coming in to attack. I guess you better man the flak gun, because nobody else is going to, that's for sure. There needs to be some sneakifying done? Well, I guess we better get player 1 to do that. As I mentioned while I was talking about the story, everything just feels horrendously artificial and gamey. One minute you're on the ground running around with a rifle, and the next, suddenly you're in an aircraft, just out of nowhere, and then right back to being on the ground again, and it doesn't seem to have had any purpose whatsoever. So not only is the story a mess, but the gameplay elements that support the story are all disparate as well. And while we're bringing this up, let's go ahead and talk about those two segments where you're not playing as an infantryman. One of them you're playing as a plane, and the other one you're playing as a tank. So here's the thing with regards to those particular segments. It is abundantly clear they were designed around a gamepad and not a keyboard and mouse. Now, at least on the plane level, you can kind of make the mouse work, because it's almost exclusively mouse controls there, but on the tank level, you can't. It's actually a bit difficult to describe exactly how the movement works in the tank on a keyboard and mouse, because I honestly don't know how it works on a keyboard and mouse. I tried to move the turret with the mouse, which is exactly what you're supposed to do, except it would move incredibly slowly. And not even a sense of, oh, well, it's a tank turret, of course it's going to be slow. No, I wish it were like that. Instead, the tank turret constantly just gets stuck. It moves ridiculously slowly to the point where it makes it seem like the sensitivity is horribly off, but there's nothing you can do to fix it. And my suspicions there were confirmed when I plugged in a gamepad, because when I moved it on the analog stick, it moved perfectly fine. It was smooth, it moved relatively quickly, actually. But on a mouse, for some reason, the sensitivity is just completely broken. And then there's the movement itself. Now, I tried to drive the tank in a manner that I would expect to be able to drive it, which is move forward or move backward, and if you have to turn the tank itself, then you're going to use the left and right movement. Well, that didn't really work. As you're probably seeing in this footage, it just kind of went wherever it wanted to go. It never really went where I was trying to get it to move. And that's where it becomes difficult to describe exactly how the controls feel on a keyboard and mouse, because when you try to move forward, it does move forward, but if you try to turn, it just kind of gets stuck in place and starts to swivel a bit. Or worse, it'll start going in a direction you don't even want it to go in. This is why when I was playing on a keyboard and mouse for the tank segment, it would constantly get the tank stuck, and I would just end up getting mowed down by the two tanks that you're going up against there, which in turn made it the worst part of the game, because it didn't function properly. Luckily, I have a gamepad, so I plugged in the gamepad, and I immediately found out that this is one of those games where, even though it's 2017, and this is a standard feature of most video games at this point, you can't just plug the gamepad in and switch over to it. Nope, instead, you have to close the game, plug in the gamepad, reopen the game, and then load to whatever level it was, and then you find that it's not letting you use the gamepad. Oh wait, you have to go into the options menu and enable the gamepad, which then switches the control scheme exclusively to gamepad, as in, the only thing you can use the keyboard and mouse on is the menus. You have to use the gamepad for everything else until you disable the gamepad, and then it switches back over to keyboard and mouse, exclusively. I honestly have absolutely no idea why they designed it this way, or if it's just a complete oversight on their part, but regardless, it's kind of irritating when there's only 2 sections in the entire game that really call for using a gamepad. The rest was perfectly fine, and in fact preferred on a keyboard and mouse, because I hate playing first-person shooters and third-person shooters for that matter on a gamepad. And frankly, why would I? It is an objectively inferior control scheme for a shooter. But I digress. I switched over to the gamepad to actually go through the tank segment, and then when it came back to the infantry segment that was after that, I switched back over to keyboard and mouse. And I discovered very quickly that switching over to the gamepad made the tank segment absolutely trivial. I mean, sure, you can't see crap because they made the viewport ridiculously small, but that doesn't really matter. When the controls aren't fighting you, that segment is ridiculously easy. The enemy AI is not capable of handling you moving around in a tank relatively quickly. So even though the only way you can damage enemy tanks is to hit them from the sides or rear, it doesn't really matter because you can basically run circles around them once the controls aren't fighting you, and that was on veteran difficulty. I imagine on recruit you would practically fall asleep while doing it. So you've got basically non-functional controls on the keyboard and mouse for the tank segment, and when you switch over to the gamepad, it's hilariously easy, and really just ends up being obnoxiously boring more than anything else. That ultimately made it the worst part of the game, but then you go into the Battle of the Bulge later on and you end up piloting an aircraft for a brief segment. And this is where things got really messy, because the controls worked okay in that particular segment until you started trying to make quick maneuvers, in which case the plane just spazzes out completely. The way it works on keyboard and mouse is that forward and backward movement control your throttle, and the mouse itself controls where the plane is turning and aiming and that sort of thing. And if you try to make quick maneuvers, then it will register the inputs wrong and send the plane careening all over the damn place. Now, of course, the sad part about this is that when you plug in the gamepad and try to use that, then you find out it's actually not a function of the control scheme. It's just the way the thing is programmed. The sensitivity on the plane is just ridiculous, and you end up spazzing out all over the place no matter what you do with that. Now, even when you do actually get it working, you find that it's basically a really crappy version of Ace Combat Assault Horizon. Because the way you do reliable damage to enemy planes is to lock on to them, which in the game consists of either holding one of the triggers or holding the right mouse button, which then goes into this zoomed in, kind of action-oriented camera where you get this kind of over-the-wing but right next to the cockpit view where you're able to target the enemy plane more efficiently, and then it just follows that enemy plane around and you're trying to shoot them down by lining up your crosshairs and actually just hitting the thing normally like you would with any other shooter. And like I said, it's a lot like how Ace Combat Assault Horizon has its sort of dogfighting view, but in this particular case it's floaty and awkward and does not work very well. But that said, even though flying the plane was a massive pain in the ass, it wasn't like playing the tank segment where on a keyboard and mouse, the standard control scheme of the platform I was playing it on, it was unplayable. But even then, both the tank and the plane segments are complete throwaways. They never happen again, and they're not for any real extended length of time. Maybe 5 minutes at most. Vehicle sections have never really been all that good in the Call of Duty series to begin with, and of course Call of Duty World War II is no exception in that regard, but these just feel especially lazy. Like they felt they had to break up the monotony, but just didn't commit to actually doing that. And that still feeds into how generic the game is overall, because it's like, oh, well, we've got the obligatory plane segment, we've got the obligatory tank segment, and speaking of obligatory things that make this even more generic, guess what? We've got obligatory segments where you're on the back of a Jeep shooting a machine gun, which has a ridiculously low rate of fire, I might add. And for more bonus points, there are a lot of quick time events in this game. And they're all of two varieties. Either you hammer a button until the game decides it's had enough of you hammering the button and lets you progress, or you have to move a cursor into an area and then click a button, or you have to press a button on the keyboard or on the gamepad face or whatever you're actually using to control the game. Every single one of them is completely lazy, it is extremely predictable, and most importantly of all, they're annoying! Developers, please, if you learn absolutely nothing else from this game, then learn this one simple reality. Nobody likes quick time events. Stop putting them in your games. If you want to put a cutscene in the game, that's fine. But don't go putting quick time events in there. They're arbitrary and nobody likes them. Oh, and speaking of pointless things that they included into the game and that they shouldn't have included in the game, collectibles. They shouldn't have put the mementos in the game at all because I only found 3 of them throughout the course of the game. You kind of have to go out of your way to find them, and they serve no purpose whatsoever. Admittedly, they're not that egregious, but it's still something that's kind of pointless, and they shouldn't have bothered putting it in the game if there was not going to be a point for it. Similarly, there's no point to the heroic actions that they put in the game as well. It's not like getting all of the heroic actions unlocks a different ending or unlocks different levels or anything like that. All it does is give you an achievement if you do them all. So what is a heroic action anyway? Well, it's one of three things. Heroic action number 1, you get enemies to surrender. How do you do that? Well, they lay down their gun anyway, but you just kind of have to aim your gun at them until the game decides, okay, well, you've aimed it at them long enough, now they've surrendered. Action 2. A friendly soldier gets injured and is lying there on the ground, screaming in pain and asking for help. You pick him up and you drag him behind cover. Now, that's a lot easier on the lower difficulties because you're not getting shot to pieces while doing that, but it's still something that's kind of pointless because it doesn't really go anywhere. And as an added bonus, it's especially pointless because when you get the guy behind cover, he gets up and goes right back into the fight. Like he was never injured at all. It's absurd. And then there's the third type of heroic action. There'll be a friendly soldier in a melee grapple with an enemy soldier. You shoot the enemy soldier and the friendly soldier is saved, therefore you have completed a heroic action. Again, goes nowhere, because that guy's probably still going to die anyway. But it's something that will pop up on a very regular basis. In fact, the melee struggle and the dragging a friendly behind cover are the ones that you're going to be encountering the most throughout the course of the game. The action to get enemies to surrender is considerably less frequent. And you know what, we're on a roll here, so let's keep going with more pointless things. There's a dialogue system in the game. You may think that that would go somewhere, except it doesn't, because it's only used for a single level. And that would be the one where you have to go undercover into a Nazi stronghold. You're given a binary choice between two options, and regardless of which one you choose, nothing really happens. You're ultimately still going to end up in the same spot doing the same exact things. Now, one system they do use relatively frequently is the stealth system, which is about as bare bones as it can possibly get. Here's how it works. The enemy has a meter that will fill up as they're spotting you. If it goes red, you're spotted and you have to go loud. It has absolutely no consequences on anything at all other than just you having to go loud. Now thankfully they don't end the level immediately upon you getting spotted, and they do give you a chance to fight your way out. But once you're spotted, there's no way to go back into stealth. You have to fight your way out. It's an all or nothing kind of thing, and it doesn't really work all that well. Now, in the segments that they do have you sneaking around, they do give you a suppressed pistol, which allows you to pick off enemies as long as you're quick about it, and you actually get headshots with it, because, again, the enemies are bullet sponges, so you may have to waste an entire magazine to take out a single guy. And if you're having to do that, then you've been spotted already, the alarm's been triggered, and you're going to have to fight your way out anyway, so there's not really much point to that. What you can do instead is sneak up behind an enemy by just crouching and then moving forward behind the enemy until you get close enough, in which case you can press the melee button and do an instant kill melee takedown. And that's really all there is to the stealth system. Just stay out of an enemy's line of sight and you're golden, basically. As I said, it is ridiculously bare bones and barely even functions properly at all, so why the hell did they even put it in the game to begin with? Oh right, because this is a generic World War II game, that's why. And here's the thing. When you take out the gimmicky sections of the levels where you're driving a tank or flying a plane or you're sneaking around or doing the dialogue sections, then it's just another Call of Duty game. The only distinguishing factor between it and something like, say, Call of Duty World at War is that this one doesn't have regenerating health in the single-player campaign. Because otherwise, 2-weapon limit, 2 grenade slots, one for regular grenades and one for tactical grenades like smoke grenades and such. You've got a melee button, which in this one you have to hit multiple times in order to take an enemy down, so it's not like in recent years where they've had the instant kill melee. Now they've made it completely useless, so there's not really any reason to bother with the melee button. All the stuff you would normally expect from a Call of Duty game is still there, all of it except the fun anyway. And almost all of the blame for that can be laid squarely at the feet of the fact that this game was built entirely around regenerating health, and then they removed the regenerating health. And the system they put in to replenish your health when they remove the regenerating health is not adequate for what the game is trying to do. The health system implies a slower, more methodical way of play, whereas the normal core gameplay mechanics that are on display here emphasize run and gun. The game is completely at odds with its own core design, and the campaign just ends up being a complete disaster on all fronts as a result. And that leaves us with only 2 more sections of gameplay to cover. These are the Zombies mode and the normal multiplayer mode. Now, they've made a fair few changes to the multiplayer mode, and I will get to that after I briefly mention the Zombies mode, which I don't care about. Look, the simple fact of the matter is I generally don't like zombie games, and I don't really like zombie modes in other games. The zombies mode for World at War was really no exception to this. It got very boring very quickly, and it was something where if you like zombies, then you'll probably be okay with it, but other than that, there's not really much point to it. The zombies mode in World War II is no exception here. It is basically the exact same gameplay that I saw as far back as World at War, but with some slightly different power-ups, some slightly different weapons here and there, and you've got a bit more story going on this time around, although I honestly don't care enough about the story to even really bother mentioning it too much. It's a goofy pulp action story that would be fitting for zombies. And let me just take a moment to reiterate the fact that this is Nazi zombies, and you've got weird sci-fi hilarity going on in a game that's supposed to be taken seriously as a war game. Now don't get me wrong, I get that the zombies mode and the multiplayer mode are two separate entities, but this is all part of the same package. Call of Duty World War II is trying to be taken seriously as a war game, and yet it has a zombies mode in it. That kind of screams disingenuous right there. But honestly, the campaign is such a travesty in itself that it doesn't even really need the zombies mode to make a mockery of itself. But as for what the zombies mode is, I'm just going to briefly go over it. You fight off waves of zombies, you get headshots for extra damage, you use the currency that you earn by just playing the game and killing zombies in order to buy things within the levels, those being either access to new areas, or new weapons, or power-ups, or something along those lines, and it's a co-op mode for up to 4 players. If that sounds like your kind of thing, then that's entirely on you, but here's the thing. I have quite a few other games I can recommend that pretty much do the exact same thing, many of which are in the Call of Duty series itself. And even though the zombies mode in this does have Ving Rhames and David Tennant in it, I'd still say it's not worth picking up the whole game just for the zombies mode. The zombies mode is what it always has been, a side mode. It's not the main attraction, and it never will be. Now these days, the main attraction for the Call of Duty series is actually the multiplayer, and I will readily admit that they've made quite a few changes to the multiplayer for this particular game. Of course, almost none of them are positive, but there's still changes, so there's that. So let's just go ahead and delve into what you're going to find when you actually hop into multiplayer here. So the first thing you're going to find out is that unlike the single player, the multiplayer, and that also includes the zombies mode, has regenerating health. The second thing you're going to notice is that the create a class system is different from what you're used to if you've been playing the last several Call of Duty games. It's still similar, but they've changed things up to now have divisions, which are basically classes. Now, when I say classes, I mean that you level them up gradually over time, and every time they hit a new tier, then you get a new bonus. So for example, you might get an extra attachment for your primary weapon, or you might be able to sprint longer, or you might be able to carry more ammunition. So regardless, as you level them up, you get more advantages. Now of course, regardless of which level your division is at, you do have a special ability to go along with it. The Airborne Division gives you a suppressor that you can fit to any submachine gun. The Expeditionary Division gives you incendiary shells for your shotguns, although you only get 4 of them. The Mountain Division gives you some assistance on using sniper rifles, namely aim assist, and you also get things like effectively the Ghost perk implemented into the division training. The Infantry Division gets a bayonet mounted on any rifle, and the Armor Division gets a bipod that gets mounted on machine guns and allows them to make a steady firing position. Some of these are obviously quite a bit more useful than others. Now that said, you may think that a bayonet wouldn't be all that useful, except that it actually makes the rifles an instant kill melee, so it actually does become pretty useful. The bipod, on the other hand, is mostly useless, because unless you're playing certain modes on certain maps, it's really not going to be advantageous to set up a firing position with an LMG. Anyway, after selecting your division, you also select a primary and secondary weapon, and you also select a basic training. Now, this is effectively the perk system in the game. You only get one of them, and you have to unlock them as you continue leveling up. Some of them are a lot more useful than others. For example, there's one that lets you reload a lot faster. Another one lets enemies who you've hit with your gunfire show up on the minimap for your teammates, although that's not as useful as you might think. But anyway, regardless of what you choose as your basic training, that's the only perk you get, and if you're used to previous Call of Duty games where you get quite a few perks available to you, then you may think that it's a bit limited in comparison. But between the combination of the division training and the basic training, you've pretty much got all the perks you need built right in. The problem is that it gives blatant advantages to people who've just played the game longer and had more time to level up their divisions. This is a theme that plagues the game not just in the division training aspect, but also in the weapon balancing, because a lot of the weapons you unlock are just blatantly better than the ones you start with, although you could very easily make the argument that the grease gun, which is the submachine gun you start with, is the best gun in the entire game, and that's all that matters. And I say that because with the exception of 4 maps, the entire game is completely dominated by submachine guns. On all but those 4 maps, 3 of which are for the war game mode exclusively, choosing anything but a submachine gun is basically deliberately weakening yourself. Because nearly all of the maps in this game are ridiculously cramped. They all favor spray and pray and close range combat, which is dominated by submachine guns. You could say, well, what about shotguns? Well, they don't actually do enough damage unless you get all of your shot on target at once. And because their rate of fire and rate of reload is so slow, there's really not much reason to use the shotguns unless you have incendiary shells, which actually do damage over time and can pretty much insta-gib anybody if you're close enough to them. But here's the thing, if you miss that shotgun shot or you don't do enough damage to take an enemy out with a single hit, then welcome back to the respawn cube, because you basically blew your one chance to actually survive a gunfight. Because the submachine gun user will just see that and go, oh, I've been hit, well I better go ahead and take this guy out, and just basically insta-gib you. There are only 2 guns right now that can actually compete with the SMGs in this, and those are the BAR and the STG-44. And even those only after you've leveled them up a bit and gotten the right attachments to make them optimal. Oh, that's right, you have to level up your weapons in this like you have with several of the previous Call of Duty games. That's how you get access to new attachments, which allow you to actually tailor the weapon to what you want to use it as, or in some cases, you require certain attachments to make the gun actually usable. Some of the guns have iron sights that are so bad you actually need the reflex sight to be able to use the thing effectively. Others are bullet hoses that you're going to almost exclusively use in hipfire, so you're going to want the steady aim attachment, or they have high enough recoil that you actually need the grip to be able to control the thing effectively. But even if you do factor in the attachments, the weapon balancing is still a complete disaster. The long range is completely dominated by sniper rifles. There's not even a single rifle that can compete with the sniper rifles because they're pretty much a one-shot kill no matter what you do. The only exception to that is the Carabine, which is a semi-automatic sniper rifle that takes 2 hits to bring an enemy down. Which of course means that absolutely nobody uses that thing. They always stick with the Lee Enfield or the Springfield, almost exclusively the Lee Enfield, because you still get one-shot kills with that thing, and you get 10 rounds. And it takes absolutely forever to unlock the Springfield anyway. I don't think I've seen a single person using the Kar 98, which isn't surprising considering you actually have to prestige the Mountain Division in order to unlock it. Oh, that's right. You actually have certain weapons in each category that can only be unlocked if you prestige the division that's associated with them. What do I mean by that? Well, the maximum level of a division is 4. Once you hit level 4, then it keeps going up until eventually you gather enough experience points to be able to prestige. If you prestige, you don't have to, then you will get access to the final weapon in a category that is appropriate for that particular division. These are the MG42, the sawed-off shotgun, the SVT-40, the Kar 98, and the MP-40. Wait a minute. The standard issue submachine gun of the German military is a prestige weapon, but one of the relatively early unlocks is a Japanese Type 100. I would like to remind you that this game takes place exclusively on the Western Front, the European theater. Only Americans versus Germans as far as the actual locations go. Where the hell did they get Japanese submachine guns? I've already rambled about the PPSH and the SVT-40, but this is just ridiculous. And don't give me that bullshit about, but DW, the multiplayer is not the campaign. Every single one of the maps in the multiplayer is also the Western Front. Again, where the hell did they get all this crap? Anyway, when you prestige a division, you completely reset its progression. So, when you go in there and you prestige your division just so you can get your one gun, then you have to go back and level up that division again. You can also do the same exact thing for all of the guns in the game as well. You can prestige the gun once you hit maximum level. It resets the progression, so now you no longer have any of the attachments. Although thankfully it does not reset the camouflages and stuff like that you've unlocked as well. So at least you've still got that stuff. But all you get for prestiging your weapon is the ability to stick a clan tag on it and get a bit extra XP when you're using it. And honestly, I think the clan tags are bugged or something because I don't remember seeing a single one. Whether on the stuff that I prestiged or on the stuff that other players might have prestiged. Since I haven't seen a single clan tag on any of the guns, whether it's prestiged or not, I'm leaning towards it's bugged. Anyway, the stuff you unlock by prestiging really isn't that much better or worse than what you get during the normal progression anyway, so it's not really like it matters all that much, but it's still annoying that you have to prestige to unlock all of the gear in the game. Before, it was just something you could do if you wanted, and it would give you some extra slots to put in new classes and things like that. Here, they deliberately lock stuff behind it to increase the grind. And that's just it. If you grind this game out, if you keep grinding for more experience points and unlock all the stuff, then you're going to have advantages over all the other players. And the problem with that is that it's completely independent of how skilled of a player you are. If the game was entirely skill-based, I wouldn't have a problem with it. But since people who've played longer just have blatant advantages over all the other players, whether or not they're actually any good at the game, it's not acceptable. So the weapon balancing is a mess, and the create a class system once again favors people who've just played the game longer, whether or not they're any good at it. What about the rest of the game? Well, as far as modes go, you've got all the standard ones, team deathmatch, domination, search and destroy, all that sort of thing. But they do introduce a game mode called War, which is an objective-based mode where two teams fight over the objectives, and when the attacking team manages to complete an objective, then things move on to the next objective, or if the defending team manages to successfully defend that particular objective, then they win. So far, there are only 3 maps that are available in the War mode, and all of them are very heavily biased toward the defenders, which isn't exactly that surprising. I mean, the defenders generally should get a bit of an advantage when they've dug in like that, but when you get down to it, the way the maps are designed in this is just a complete mess. I've already mentioned before that the game is completely dominated by SMGs except in the War mode and except on one map that's available in the other modes, and that is because everything except the War modes are really cramped maps. They have a lot of side areas that you can get into and then just flank enemies without too much trouble, which ultimately means that it's a complete clusterfuck when you get into the main maps, whereas when you go into the War maps, you actually end up with quite a bit more distance than what you see in the other maps, and sniping is kind of rampant. There's one map in particular that's an absolute travesty, where you have a bridge that's spanning the middle of the map, and if the attacking team manages to get to that point, then it's just miserable on both sides. Because the attacking team is trying to build the bridge, and the defending team is picking them off like it's nothing, but they don't really have all that much cover either, so they're getting picked off too, and you just end up with this kind of endless cycle of everybody sniping each other, and it just gets ridiculous. And that's 1 out of the 3 maps. The other 2 are almost worse than it. One of them has the attacking team storming the beach, and the defending team gets access to emplaced guns, which makes it just a complete cakewalk. And then the last one has a fair few cramped areas, and on top of that, the attacking team has to escort some tanks until eventually they have to start stealing objectives from the enemy team, and it just ends up becoming a complete mess. Plus, the developers were forgetting something incredibly important when it comes to Call of Duty. Your average Call of Duty player has absolutely no idea what teamwork is. They're much more concerned with padding their KD ratio. As a result, pretty much everybody in the War mode runs around like headless chickens and doesn't even bother going for the objectives. It ends up being a complete disaster. Thus, an entire game mode, one that they introduced to this thing to try something different, ends up being completely miserable to play, because basically nobody works as a team, and when one team is actually getting some teamwork in, they're always going to win, no matter what. This leaves the rest of the standard Call of Duty modes that we've come to expect, and those are pretty much the same as they've always been. The problem isn't so much with the modes, though, it's with the maps. Every single one of them is absolutely terrible. But the absolute worst map in the entire game is the Gustav Cannon, which has this very large cannon in the middle of the map, which grants a perfect sight radius of everywhere else on the map. Which means that the people who go up there and just camp that area basically always win because nobody can really get to them in time to take them out. And the rest of the maps just end up being chaotic clusterfucks that become absolutely infuriating. And to make matters worse, they still haven't managed to fix the spawn system, so you'll basically spawn right next to an enemy and get mowed down almost instantly, which also becomes absolutely infuriating. Thus, when you play multiplayer in Call of Duty World War II, it mostly feels like you're just bashing your head against a concrete wall, expecting the wall to move. It's an absolutely unbalanced mess with absolutely horrible maps, and on top of all of that, the netcode is a mess. Admittedly, that's pretty much par for the course with Call of Duty these days, but it's still incredibly irritating that they haven't fixed it yet. This has been a problem for years, and they still haven't managed to fix it. Hell, they barely even managed to get dedicated servers into this one before they decided to take them down for the console version, and I don't know if the dedicated servers are still up for the PC or not, but I have noticed that the lag compensation seems to be getting worse, so they may not be. But of course, even if the game does have dedicated servers, it doesn't tell you if you're on one, and the ping indicators are pretty much useless because they're the 3-bar system, so it's pretty much impossible to tell what your actual ping is. And they even removed the network icons from the multiplayer, so now you can't even tell what the problem is, whereas in the beta they actually had enabled them, so you could at least say, oh, well, there's some packet loss going on or something like that. Now you have no idea. This leads me to a statement that I should never be able to make about any game in existence, but the beta worked better than this. And not only did it work better from a netcode standpoint, it actually ran better too! I am running a GTX 1080 and an i7 4790K with 16 gigs of RAM. I should not be running into severe performance drops, yet I do, frequently, well below 60 frames per second. Meanwhile, when you go with the beta, I don't think there was a time where it ran below 90 frames per second. And even then, a beta would still have an excuse because at least it wasn't a finished product. Now the game's out, it runs worse than the beta, it has worse netcode than the beta apparently, and on top of all of that, the balancing is worse, and the maps are worse. It's frankly shocking. The game is supposed to be better by the time it launches, not worse. And yet, here we are. As I'm uploading this video late, it's actually 10 days after the game launched, and the only thing I can say works without any problem whatsoever is the headquarters mode. This is the social area where you get to run around and interact with other players, and you get to go collect orders, which will give you armory credits, which you can then spend on buying things in the shop, which is basically stuff like pistol grips, or various costumes, or things like that. As I'm recording this video, there's no way to spend actual money on any of this, or the loot boxes for that matter, but you know damn well they're going to put it in later on. As it stands, about the only way you can reliably get armory credits is to complete orders, which are just basic challenges, things like get X number of kills with rifles or whatever. And once you complete an order, you have to go to the list of orders in the main menu and actually select the one that you completed in order to receive the reward. The rewards include both armory credits and loot boxes, also known as supply crates. Because of course, every modern AAA game has to have loot boxes in it, right? Thanks, Overwatch. But the loot boxes are especially disgusting in Call of Duty World War II because you can open them in front of other players. That's right, if you open a loot box while you're in the headquarters mode, everyone around you can see what you got. It's a pretty disgusting way to try to make the loot boxes a community thing and try to really push you towards getting more of them because, hey, isn't it fun to open loot boxes in front of other people? It's just sickening that we've gotten to this point, frankly. But apart from collecting orders and going to the quartermaster to get the various collection items or orders to get you more crates or whatever, or opening loot boxes in front of other people, there's not that much you can actually do in the headquarters. There's a firing range that you can mess around with to just try out different combinations and see what works for you and what doesn't, and there's an area where you can train your score streaks to just mess around with those and see how they work. But other than that, there's only really two things you can interact with. The first of them is a 1v1 arena where you hop into a queue, and then once you're selected, you select an item to ban, and then they select an item to ban, and whatever's left, you go and you do a 1v1 fight with. This can get kind of silly because you can end up with a 1v1 fight with shovels, for example, but it's still something to do, right? Doesn't really get you anything, but it is kind of silly. And then aside from that, about the only thing you can do is you can actually play old Atari games. There's actually a spot where you can go and spend armory credits in order to play Atari games like Pitfall. It's kind of weird and out of place, but it's something, I guess. Pretty much everything else you need to do can just be done through the main menu, and you don't need to interact with anybody anyway during that, so why even bother including the headquarters mode to begin with? The only reason I can really think of is to incentivize people to get loot boxes so they can show them off to other players. Now, as it stands, there's nothing gameplay affecting in any of the loot boxes, it's only cosmetic items. But that could very well change, because we know damn well that Activision has done that before with previous Call of Duty games, where they've introduced new weapons to the game and only made them available in the supply crates that you can buy in their stores. I have absolutely no doubt that that's going to happen with Call of Duty World War II as well, because it's happened with the past several Call of Duty games. And the worst part is, I know there are people out there who actually try to defend pay-to-win bullshit. And that is simultaneously disheartening and absolutely sickening. And while Call of Duty World War II is not there yet, we all know damn well it's going to hit that point eventually. And we need to make it abundantly clear that that is completely unacceptable. But anyway, that's pretty much all there is to talk about with Call of Duty World War II. The single player is an absolute disaster. The zombies mode is just more zombies if that's your thing, and if it's not, then you don't really care like I ended up with. And the multiplayer is a poorly coded, unbalanced mess with absolutely horrendous maps. And on top of all of that, it has one of the most insultingly annoying ways of shoving microtransactions in your face, even though the microtransactions aren't in the game yet. And when you bring all of that together, not only do you end up with a game that's terrible based on its own gameplay faults and its own coding problems, but it makes such a mockery of World War II while simultaneously trying to be the most pathetically generic World War II shooter ever made that it ends up being downright insulting. I have played games with worse writing. I have played games with worse mechanics. But even with those stipulations, this is the worst World War II shooter I have ever played, because at least those other games aren't insulting. I give it a 1 out of 5. Avoid this game like the plague. There are so many other World War II shooters out there, many of which I've already reviewed on my channel, that are much better games than this. And even though they aren't as high fidelity as this one, that doesn't matter. They're just better. Go with those. Avoid Call of Duty World War II. It is garbage. Thanks for watching.